So, hi everyone. My name is Evan, and I'm the current president of the UAMSA, or the University at Albany Mind Studies Association. So, thank you for coming, and thank you for Dr. Gaesser for your willingness to be here with us tonight. Before we get started, I just want to take this time to say that you are being recorded, so just you're aware, and that the Q&A session and this talk will both be available on our YouTube page sometime tomorrow. We've been pretty good about getting it up pretty quickly. So if you end up wishing that you took better notes, then we have you covered. First, a little bit about the University at Albany Mind Studies Association. It's a registered grad student organization at the University at Albany, designed to bring together graduate students across departments who are working on or research or interested in issues related to the mind. Our goal is to foster interdisciplinary dialogue, education, collaboration on topics including, but not limited to, artificial intelligence, moral psychology, consciousness, perception, language, rationality and reasoning, music and animal cognition, and neuroethics. So while we are a grad student organization, faculty and interested undergrads are always welcome to any and all of our events. And if you're interested in keeping up to date with what the organization is doing or with future events, the best way to do that is by subscribing to our email listserv. And many of you are probably already on the listserv. But instructions for how to subscribe, if you're not, are available in the chat soon, hopefully. Undergrads and faculty are welcome to subscribe to the listserv as well. But subscribing to the listserv is especially important if you're a grad student, because anyone is welcome to come to the events, but because we're a grad student organization, only grad students get a say in deciding what those events are. And the only way to get a say is by attending a planning meetings. And the only way to know about the planning meetings is to be on the listserv. So we also, as of very recently, have a Twitter account, which you can find at @UAlbanyMind, and that might be linked in the chat soon as well. And hopefully, and we should be putting up notices for those events as well there. And the format for tonight, there's 30 minutes allotted for the talk, which if you don't end up spending the 30 minutes, then we'll just take it into Q&A. And they're followed by 30 minutes for an open Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can indicate that you have a question in the chat by sending the word question, at which point you'll be added to the queue. We ask that you keep your mic off during the Q&A until Jeff, who is on our e-board, who's moderating, indicates that it's your turn to ask a question. Or you can also type your question directly into the chat and have Jeff ask it for you if you would rather not turn your mic on. Like, I don't know, if, for instance, you have two really terrible dogs that don't stop barking. So that's also an option. Finally, with us tonight is Dr. Brendan Gaesser, and I hope this information is up to date, so you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. He is an assistant professor of psychology at the University at Albany. And before that, he was a postdoctoral researcher at Boston College in the Morality Lab and affiliated with the Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience Lab. He also received his PhD from Harvard University, where he was a graduate student in the Memory Lab. His research is broadly focused on the social functions of and cognitive mechanisms underlying imagination, memory, and future thinking, and in particular, how imagining the future and remembering the past can facilitate social decision-making and economic behavior directed at benefiting the welfare of others. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Dr. Gaesser.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Evan, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm gonna keep it, it's Friday, and the end of the semester at 6 p.m., so I'm fine with this being a little loose. It sounds like decorum, though, is questions not until the end. Like, it's going to be kind of set like that.
That's how we've been doing it, but if you want to change it up, then we'll...
Yeah, I would say, if you're okay with this, like, if there's a clarification question, then I'm fine with people asking those along the way. But if you want to wait for, like, bigger kind of discussion points or something that could kind of spawn off into its own little side topic, then hold those for the end, because I'm going to move pretty quickly through data. I'll try to like set up key concepts, but yeah, if there's a piece of data that you want clarification on, like, don't hesitate to just hit me in the chat, and I can try to catch it.
Go ahead and put that question in the chat, and I'll take care of that for you as moderator for you.
All right. All right, let's do the share screen. So I just disabled attendee screen share. So I just need to get added as a co-host, I think.
I think I just changed it again, so I might try again. I think that should work.
Yep, there it goes. Okay. All right, can people see the slides okay? Awesome. All right, so let's roll. So as Evan kind of said, one of the topics that people are interested in kind of finding overlap across departments. And as you'll see towards the end of the talk, we've already started working with a student and Will Kidder and Professor Jason DeCruz in the philosophy department on some overlapping topics of interest. And I'm going to kind of save those for the end because I figure it will kind of spawn into bigger discussion from there. But just so that we're all kind of clear, this talk is going to be focused on moral psychology. Moral philosophy is going to show up in a couple places, but the distinction being that with moral psychology, it's the science of what people think is good and evil, what people think is right and wrong. It's so these are going to be people's judgments. These are going to be their decisions related to these type of situations. It's not going to be claims about what is objectively right and wrong. I leave that much more difficult task to the philosophers. Right, so this is going to include the gamut of the morally reprehensible to the morally exceptional and praiseworthy. So on the one side, you have things like genocide, psychopathy. On the other, you have kind of like extraordinary acts of generosity, helping during a crisis, people donating organs to strangers. And the question that broadly that I'm interested in answering is, what is it about our minds and brains that gives rise to and informs our moral decisions and moral behaviors? For the last few years have been focused more on the positive side, and not necessarily at like the extremely and rare cases of generosity, but more on sort of the everyday type of situations of helping, and looking at things like economic donations online. Because this is a crisp 30 minutes, there's some data that like I've just pushed to the end and I want to kind of see where questions go. So the economic donation stuff, I don't have in the main talk, but if you want to know about it, I have like slides on that ready to roll at the end that I'd be happy to get into. So the question that has kind of been motivating me specifically for the last 4 or 5 years is, why do people help others? It's a big question, and people have identified a number of cognitive and affective mechanisms and their underlying brain regions that have a role to play here. And what quickly kind of the field realized is like, there isn't just like one region or one set of regions or one specific process that is going to drive people's willingness to help others. There isn't just going to be one region or set of regions that's like the moral, the core moral brain region or something like that, right? And this is intentionally to overwhelm. I'm not interested in you learning all these brain regions or unpacking all these acronyms, but the point is that like researchers have identified a number of neural systems and the cognitive affective processes they support playing a role in moving around people's decisions of whether they'd be willing to help others. So you have things like empathy, you have things like affect sharing. So, your ability to experience the same emotions as someone else. And another kind of process that's received a good amount of attention in the field is the ability to consider explicitly the thoughts and feelings of a person in need, right? Now, this has been called a number of things in the field. And depending on where you are, I just kind of want to be clear in how I'm using it, and the terms are kind of akin to it. So the purposes of this talk, I'm going to refer to this as theory of mind, but it also gets called perspective taking in the literature as well as mentalizing. But the point is that like we have the ability to explicitly consider the mental states of someone else. What are they thinking and what are they feeling in the moment? And research has shown that you can do manipulations on theory of mind and perspective taking, and you know it can promote a willingness to help others in need. And that's all well and good. I'm not going to try to push back on that literature. But when I first kind of approached this question, and I was coming from a lab where we were looking at the relationship between memory and imagination, I kind of started thinking, well, is it just about, you know, being able to represent other people's mental and affective states that matters? Could there also be this role for your ability to imagine the act of helping in a specific time and place? So the way that I'm going to use imagination is not in some very broad and vague sense. I'm going to refer to it and as a particular flavor. And in the literature, this is known as episodic simulation. So imagination can capture, you know, multiple things, but the way that I'm using it is to refer to episodic simulation, which is the ability to imagine novel events, specific in time and place, typically set in one's personal future. Episodic simulation is thought to be like intimately connected to episodic memory, your ability to represent events that are specific in time in your past. And a number of studies have shown at this point that both being able to remember past events and imagine new and future events draw on and are supported by the same set of brain regions known as the medial temporal lobe subsystem. And what these regions are doing, they each have different roles to play, but basically in coordination, they allow us to integrate details, integrate people and objects into a location to form a scene that can then unfold over time like a mental movie, right? So this is distinguished from something like semantic knowledge, you know, or knowledge of like general facts. It's your ability to like really kind of picture people and objects and environments interacting with one another. We know that if you damage these regions, particularly the parahippocampus and hippocampus, it impairs one's ability to kind of form and represent these episodes. So the classic examples of this are like amnesic patients who have typically have damage in the medial temporal lobes. Not only can they have difficulty remembering past events, but it turns out they have parallel deficits in imagining new events. And there's so much evidence at this point that basically when you go to imagine specific events, what you're doing is you're recombining details from past experiences in order to form new representations. Okay, and we also know, just kind of driving home the connection here, we know that you can do manipulations of specificity and detail that increase your ability to remember past events. So you can do manipulations of specificity and show that it increases the amount of detail that people can remember from past events. And that after doing that same manipulation, it will increase detail for imagined events, but it's selective to memory and imagination. And it doesn't increase or affect the detail that one generates when trying to just describe a picture or a scene that's directly in front of them, right? So it's just further evidence that like you can manipulating memory leads to a similar manipulation in imagination. They draw on the same set of cognitive processes, the same system. So we know that like medial temporal lobe system allows you to construct these events. And then one thing that it can, what it does is then it feeds these events, it feeds these simulations into the VMPFC, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, and other regions that kind of read out the emotional quality and the emotional value of these events. And that's a very powerful thing, like to be able to represent events that you haven't directly experienced means that you're able to kind of read out and anticipate how one would feel in those situations and make decisions about those events without the cost of actually engaging in behavior. Now, it's not a perfect system. It's not that it perfectly resembles reality, but the point is that it's close enough that it provides a huge advantage for us. And I'm not going to review everything here, but in terms of like the functional outcomes and impact, it's been shown that our ability to imagine events, can shift us to make more far-sighted choices. We come to value the future more, the more vividly we can represent those events. It helps with emotional regulation. It helps, literally with navigation. But before the work from myself and colleagues and a number of collaborators got started, they weren't really considering, well, how does this system feed into moral decisions? How does it, which is a huge, which is a pretty important outcome in terms of impact on human life and society. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from, and that's how I got started. And the first set of studies are just behavioral manipulations looking at that. And what we found is you can have people imagine helping episodes. So you're in the lab, you give them situations of need, you give them situations of people in need, and then you have them either imagine a helping episode, remember a past related helping episode, or you have them think or estimate ways that they could help conceptually, but without having them generate and represent the event, or you just give them the situation of need, give them the person in need, but don't have them think about helping. That's the no condition here. And what we found is that subjects report being more willing to help in the imagined condition consistently, and that they show a similar increase when they imagine a helping episode as well as when they remember one. But there's a flexible advantage for imagination compared to memory, where subjects were able to imagine helping on almost every situation of need or every trial of need we could throw at them. But they only had so many related past events that they could draw on. And so there were trials which they were so new or so novel for that person that they couldn't come up with a related past helping episode. And when that occurs, their willingness to help is at baseline. You don't see that increase in willingness to help other people. And you can do this cute calculation, which, 11.6, you can't read too much in that because you're at ceiling in the imagine condition. But the point is just to illustrate that there's a flexible advantage for imagining compared to remembering. We found that people's ratings of how subjectively detailed, coherent, how vivid in one's mind's eye the scene was, predicted willingness to help. So the more vividly that one kind of represents the helping episode in their mind, whether it's imagined or remembered, the more willing you are to help in that situation, the more kind of subjectively plausible it seems that you would help in that situation. And what was neat, in subsequent work, we found that this effect didn't seem to matter whether you're imagining yourself or imagining someone else helping. Vividness, these kind of scene imagery, vividness ratings were still predicting willingness to help, even when you're imagining someone else helping. And so once started seeing this evidence for the scene mechanism, there was a question of well, how distinguishable is this from sort of that theory of mind mechanism that's so well known in the field? Is this scene mechanism, this kind of visual spatial mechanism, operating independently or interacting with representations of other people's mental states? And so we did a neuroimaging study to try to first start to tease this apart. So subjects were in the brain scanner, and we looked at neural activity while they were kind of engaged in remembering and imagining helping episodes. And so we're looking to see whether there's activity in the medial temporal lobe subsystem that kind of predicts or distinguishes this increase in willingness to help for imagining and remembering. But we also included a theory of mind localizer, and we're looking to see whether activity in regions associated with theory of mind in a separate task is also coming online and predicting increase in willingness to help during the imagination, while subjects are imagining and remembering helping episodes. So this is just behavioral results, similar control and episodic conditions as before, the imagining, remembering. We saw a similar increase in subjects' willingness to help. We replicated that gap, that flexible gap between remembering and imagining again in this later work. In terms of neuroimaging results, we found that activity in the parahippocampus and the hippocampus in particular was tracking with the increase in the increase in willingness to help in the imagine and remember episode condition. So this kind of provided further evidence for the scene account. We next looked to see whether activity associated with subjects' mental states, with thinking of other people's mental states, that perspective taking theory of mind ability. So this is like whether it was also predicting this interaction. And we did find that one region within this network, the right temporal parietal junction, was in a very similar way to the parahippocampus and hippocampus, was tracking with willingness to help and predicting willingness or associated with willingness to help increase when subjects were imagining or remembering. And so this kind of like, this made things interesting. This kind of like the plot thickened for us of, okay, so we have evidence for the C mechanism, but based on these results, it now seems like there could also be, there could also be this mental state or theory of mind mechanism as well. And so what we did is to follow this up and kind of try to disassociate the contribution of these systems, we used transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is basically, there's a figure-8 coil, and you run a lot of electricity through it. It's almost when you were a kid, if you took a nail and like in science, like 3rd grade science class, and you wrapped it in a coil, ran electricity through it, you could magnetize the nail. It's very similar physical concept here, where you're just running a lot of current through this coil, and you can create a localized disruption in the electromagnetic field that disrupts activity in the cortical region underlying the coil. And so they've shown, past work has shown that disrupting activity in the right temporal parietal junction disrupts theory of mind, it disrupts mentalizing ability. And so what we did is we applied TMS to this region, to this theory of mind region, and we're looking to see, while subjects were remembering and imagining helping episodes, and in the control condition where you're not applying TMS to the RTPJ, we show a similar increase in willingness to help as we previously saw. The critical question is what happens to willingness to help when you disrupt activity in the RTPJ? If willingness to help goes down, that difference between the episodic and control condition goes down, then that suggests that the RTPJ and theory of mind may be necessary for this effect. If it doesn't, and it remains the same, then that suggests that the activity in the medial temporal lobe, which is undisrupted in this study, may primarily underlie this effect. And so sure enough, that's what we found. We found that like we didn't really see a decrease in the condition difference or the increase in willingness to help when people generated imagine and remembered helping episodes when that activity associated with theory of mind was disrupted. So that suggests that the primary driver in terms of neural basis here could be activity within that medial temporal lobe subsystem. Okay, this is gonna be a really quick side thing because I think I've spent so much time in the last like year or two, thinking about these systems and these cognitive processes and kind of really diving into the literature about, it's clear that they're independent, but when do they interact with one another? And that led to this kind of side theory, which is beyond moral psychology. And I'm just gonna do this really quick illustrative walkthrough. What is this person thinking and feeling, right? So just think to yourself, what is this person thinking or feeling? What about now? What about now? And so there's an idea that I've kind of put together that just came out in Cognition a few months ago that called the episodic mind reading hypothesis, which is basically that the medial temporal lobe systems and the kind of like your episodic memory and simulation system, its ability to combine people and objects and integrate them with a scene to form a mental movie is going to, in certain situations, give rise to and inform your ability to perceive their mental states. Now that's kind of beyond this talk, but for anybody that's interested in sort of the interaction between representing scenes and episodes and representing other people's affective and mental states, this is kind of the paper to dive into. Now, back to moral psychology. Right, so we got these like really cool behavioral results. We got these cool neuroimaging results. And then it kind of like, it started percolating, these ideas started percolating a little bit in the field. And Morris Moskovich at University of Toronto reached out, and he's like, you know, and his graduate student, Caspian Swazik, you know, reached out, and they're like, hey, we have access, we've seen some of this work, we have access to patients with lesions in the medial temporal lobes. It'd be, you know, would you be interested in kind of like collaborating on a project to see if patients that kind of have damage to the system do these kind of effects the boost from generating episodes? Does it kind of go away? And so we had a different like control condition, is kind of word generation, word fluency condition, and we're just looking at people imagining episodes versus this words control. The CTRL, that control is the population. So these are healthy subjects with healthy brains. WH is willingness to help. We also include a measure of empathic concern. And what we found is that in healthy controls with intact medial temporal lobe regions, they show an increase in willingness to help in the imagined condition, and they also show an increase in empathic concern. But the patients with medial temporal lobe damage don't see that boost from imagining compared to the control, right? So it's not that these amnesic patients, or not these patients with medial temporal lobe damage, are like, you know, it's not that they are unempathic. It's not like they're uncaring and they're unwilling to help. It's just that you don't see this modulation from being able to generate episodes, from being able to picture, you know, people in need and how you're going to respond to them. All right. So related work has come out that kind of, and this is what people might be a little bit more, especially people in moral philosophy, might be a little bit more familiar with, where, you know, moral dilemmas and the Trolley problem have kind of been done almost ad nauseum at this point, though we've learned a lot from them. There have been great insights and theories kind of built on them of, you know, when is it okay to harm one person in order to save the many? In this case, you know, this specifically being like, when is it okay to harm one worker in order to save the many? You have different versions, flipping a switch versus pushing someone. But there have been like recent efforts where they've run patients with medial temporal lobe damage. So I wasn't involved in these set of studies, but I just think they're really interesting and kind of help and align with some of the work that I was just showing you. And so they've done these set of studies where they take these, you know, healthy controls intact in the green areas, like intact medial temporal lobe. Like, so you know, in the healthy control, you can see you don't even have to like, I mean, of course they quantify the difference in anatomy, but just, you can even see kind of anecdotally, intuitively, that the patient's MTL region in green here is much smaller, much more atrophied compared to healthy control participant. They run them through these different type of dilemmas, and you don't need to walk through or know all the data. The key is sort of like this personal high conflict condition. That's like the pushing, the footbridge dilemma, where you push someone in order to save the many. And they found that these amnesic patients are way more likely to say that it's not okay to push the one to save the many. And what the reading of this is that an amnesic patient can represent a single person. They can represent a single person and sort of the pain that they would experience. But what they can't do and what they have difficulty doing is representing the broader scene or the broader episode of the trolley dilemma. And so when you just give them these written narratives that they then have to try to represent, they have difficulty doing that, and they become fixated on the pain of the one individual and not on like playing out that scenario and the outcome of saving the many and like, how they would respond, which I just think is like nicely kind of aligns with the results that we were finding with collaborators, and kind of tells a story of converging evidence of the medial temporal lobes and sort of episodic memory and simulation coming into play and affecting people's moral decisions. All right, so that's kind of been focused on the positive side of things. Kind of heading towards the end, I've got a few more data points to show, and then we can open it up. So it'll probably take like another 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up. So we've been focused on sort of like the inputs here to the positive side of moral psychology, but the claim has never been that episodic memory and episodic simulation are inherently morally positive. It's just that those are where most people tilt, and I think we're like from an applied perspective where we can do the most good. But we've started like looking at and exploring questions on the other side, and started looking at how episodic simulation relates to moral decisions and emotions and behavior related to immoral actions. And so for the first kind of set of studies on this, it's a collaboration with Fiery Cushman and his student Adam Morris is kind of driving the project, where we just gave subjects really simple kind of everyday harms. So the first set of studies, there's nothing like egregiously violent. It's kind of like, pushing someone to like, get a seat on the bus sort of thing. Like, so it's mild, relatively mild harms. And what we found is that so the question kind of driving the project was, okay, which way is this going to swing? When you have people imagine harming others, is it going to be the case that it's going to generate an aversive signal, which they then use to say, no, I wouldn't do that, I shouldn't do that? Or is it going to be something that parallels sort of the willingness to help judgments that we've seen earlier? And basically you use that episode that you generate as diagnostic knowledge of what you would do or what you should do. It's like, if you could represent it, then you say, oh yeah, no, I'd be more willing to do that because I can see myself doing it, right? And so that was kind of the question, kind of driving the study, motivating the study. And we found that like when you have people, and Fiery in particular, thought that like it would almost assuredly generate the aversive signal. And but we were kind of open. We were open to the possibility to go either way. And what we found is that when you had people generate or imagine the mild harm episodes, it shifted the justification. So people became more certain and were felt more justified after imagining the episodes. And they found that, and then we did like condition differences where we said like, it's either justified or it's unjustified. And you show, similar to the previous work, that the vividness of the scene imagery, the vividness of the simulation tracks with people's judgments of the likelihood that they perform the harm. They feel more willing, that they'd be more willing to engage in the harm the more vividly that they represent it. And not only that, but we found that it was increasing positive affect for the harm. It was leading to this like positive affective signal, so that when you had people imagining the harm, they would spontaneously come to justify it more. And then they would come to feel more positive about engaging the harm, and that was affecting their willingness or the perceived likelihood to perform the harm, which was, you know, we were open to the possibility, but certainly like we were more weighted on the other side of this, which leaned to the affective signal. So we've kind of like, I'm not going to get into all the studies. We ran something like 5 different versions of this, and it all kind of tells a similar story when it comes to mild harm. But there's a question at like the deeper end of the pool, which is, you know, does this kind of affect, what is the relation between imagination and people's judgment of the harm for something that is kind of more extraordinary, more violent, more kind of out there? And that kind of led to reading some ideas in philosophy on imaginative resistance. And so this is something kind of like exploring a little bit on our own, but then we kind of like ran into Jason DeCruz and his graduate student, Will Kidder, and they were kind of like, you know, had been thinking about some of these ideas as well. And I was like, great, it's like, we should do a project on, you know, that starts to look at taking some of the questions that arise from philosophy on imaginative resistance and looking at sort of like the psychological reality of some of what's been proposed. And so the basic idea with imaginative resistance, it shows up in different ways, but one of the initial instantiations of it is that it's a claim that people have difficulty representing and accepting morally reprehensible things as being okay, as being morally right, even if you try to like separate them into like a fictional world where you say that it's okay to engage in these behaviors, right? And so the idea is that like you have difficulty accepting, representing this, and you know, perhaps that difficulty in representing and accepting leads to being less likely to engage in something like that, less likely to endorse that. And then it was like, well, maybe like imaginative resistance is something that's like inhibited, diminished, or otherwise attenuated in psychopathy. Maybe people that are high in psychopathy don't have this kind of you know, imaginative gating or regulating mechanism, and so they have no problem representing these events, and therefore have no problem accepting them as okay. And then because they can represent them more vividly, they then are like more likely to endorse or engage in these behaviors. And so that's what's kind of motivating it. We did a series of studies. This is Dylan Campbell is a graduate student working in my lab who kind of spearheaded this with Will Kidder, the philosophy grad student. And we give them a series of scenarios that are kind of structured after some classic examples in philosophy, where you have a neutral setup, right? That isn't like morally charged. So Sarah enjoyed nature photography and wanted to get a photograph of the Grand Canyon. She decided to take a tour of the canyon, and at the end of her tour, she arrived at what she thought would be a perfect location of her photograph near the edge of the canyon, right? They see that, and then there's some immoral action or morally charged action that occurs. Another member of her tour group, Paul, was standing in the photograph. Sarah asked Paul to move out of the way several times, but he would not move, thinking that, you know, this was a funny prank. Finally, Sarah charged towards Paul, pushed him over the edge of the canyon. She watched him fall asleep, snap his neck on a rock with a bone sticking out his shoulder, then returned to her camera and took her photograph. And then what you do is, once you have that kind of action section, you then provide a moral evaluation. Oh, it's not. Shoot, it won't come in. But it's at the very bottom is the evaluation part, which is killing Paul was the right thing to do for Sarah to do. After all, Paul was standing in the way of the photograph, right? And so what you find is most people, we do a series of judgments of like, you know, what's the morality of this? Is it okay in this fictional world? Is it, you know, can you imagine it being okay and acceptable in this world? That's the imaginability rating. And then does the subject, you know, does the agent, in this case Sarah, like believe what they did was right or okay? And so kind of in your kind of like a baseline normal subjects, you find this, you know, ratings go down as soon as the immoral action, and they don't change much for the moral evaluation. People don't come back, you know, people don't accept that like something would be right in that world or imagine that it's okay in that world just because you tell them that it's okay, right? They're resistant to accepting that. And in this study, I think it was study 2, we included a measure of psychopathy. So this isn't, these aren't clinically defined psychopaths. There's a number of dimensions that go into it, but you can have these like personality psychopathy subscales and look at variation in the general population on being, higher or lower on these ratings, on these psychopathy ratings. And what we found is that individuals that are higher in these psychopathy ratings are much more likely to, to accept, the action, the immoral action and evaluation being right in that fictional world, as well as have higher ratings of imaginability for the immoral action and the moral evaluation. So it's super interesting, and it opens up this this new branch of studies to kind of like further go after and really, really push this. It's like, when do you break imagination in sort of like the normal, healthy individuals where they have difficulty representing immoral events? How does that inform the way they feel about those events, what they do about those events, versus like what individuals do you have this kind of like resistance or regulation attenuated, and then how does it affect what they think is okay and ultimately what they do? So yeah, we don't have, stay tuned for that, but it's been really great. And this is why I'm so excited for this talk series, not just to present today, but just for its existence at the university, because I think some of the most interesting ideas occur at the intersection and crosstalk across departments. And it's been so fun to work on this project, which is under revision. Fingers crossed it'll get accepted before, not too long, but stay tuned for that. All right, so moving forward, continue to build on these projects. We have a little branch looking at how imagination affects charitable donations. I'm not, for time reasons, not going to get into that, but we do have those studies showing these effects translating to actual economic decisions. We have a series of studies that don't have anything to do with morality and look at how imagination operates in relationships in social groups. And then we have another set of studies that have nothing to do with imagination, that just have to do with morality, looking at people's moral judgments of inequality and equality and empathy and altruism. But I feel like those are just separate talks, so I'm not going to get into them. But I feel like particularly the last one I could see of being interested in among this group. So yeah, just putting that on the radar. But yeah, thank you so much to be here. Thank you so much to the graduate students, army of graduate students that have contributed to this work, and research assistants. Thank you to the labs that help incubate it. And yeah, thanks for being here. Looking forward to getting into the questions.
All right, thank you. I guess we're going to open it up for Q&A, so I'll let Jeff take over here, and he'll be moderating the questions for us.
All right, go ahead. If you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat room, and we'll start with Natalie. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question.
I clicked the button, but it wouldn't let me speak. Anyway, thank you again for speaking with us. It was very interesting, especially getting to see some, a lot of data. And so my question revolves around the data. I might have missed this. For all these subjects, particularly in the study where they're imagining themselves, being helpful, are these subjects of what age range and gender, and would you expect to see differences between these sorts of groups?
Yeah, so we do have, there's so much data, not just in this talk, but like you just have to cut so much. So there are, so the first question is aging. The stuff that you saw here was mostly younger adult. The patient population study with the collaborators at the University of Toronto is a middle-aged to older adult sample. So those patients are, in like their 40s, 60s kind of area. And we do have 2 studies on the older adult side of things. We haven't looked at any of this in kids, but I'm sure there's going to be some lab that's better suited to do that. But yeah, we do see that boost in generating the episodes for older adults as well. It seems like it's a little bit more mixed than the younger adults. And we're kind of like talking about like, is that because you tend to see impaired memory function the older that individuals get? That's kind of an open question right now. I don't think we have enough to speak that. In terms of gender, you see these effects across both genders. Sometimes we've seen hints that they're slightly stronger in females than males, but it's never been super consistent. And I think if to make any claims along those lines, I kind of view it, based on all the data that we have now, I would say it's just a general human thing, but I'm open to the possibility that there could be a slight modulation there if you had a large enough sample, but it's not something that we consistently see. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Scott, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
So first of all, thanks for the talk. I thought it was really interesting. So I'm particularly curious about, on the morally reprehensible side of things, the cases where imagining harm, doing harm to someone. So there's some evidence, right, and some you pointed to, that suggests that people with who suffer from psychopathy, who rank high enough on the PCLR, get they struggle with various kinds of memory, right, episodic memory in particular. And some philosophers have argued that this should mean that we think that they're not morally responsible for their behavior because they're not able, the particular way in which that episodic memory works suggests that they're not able to see the victims as people, as persons, right? So what I'm wondering is when you were asking people to imagine these harm cases, were they imagining them sort of in the abstract? Are they imagining performing the harm, or are they imagining being the victim? And if you don't have data from those three different kinds of categories, I wonder if in those three different kinds you might stimulate different kinds of behavior in the population, right, in the control case, but you wouldn't be able to in people with lesions in, say, the empty subsystem or the VMPFC or something like that, right?
Yeah. So there's a lot packed in there, Scott. There's a lot of sub questions, and they're really interesting branches to fall. And so I'll take a shot at it, but feel free to be like, to walk me back. So in the case of the harm scenarios, it's always the work with Adam Morris and Ferry Cushman. You're always imagining yourself being the one to harm. We didn't have people imagine themselves as the person in need or as the victim. So there is a question of like, could agency matter there? It absolutely could. And there's a way to infer that, in that I actually just had a meeting yesterday with some collaborators at McGill, and they've done some studies where they don't do the go on to generate the helping episode. It's just have people give them situations of like an individual person need, don't give them much info about like, what's happening, and then you see and have them just simulate the person's misfortune. And when you do that, these are healthy individuals, intact brains. They like personal distress goes up. It seems. Right. Seems like personal distress goes up, and we don't have any data set that has the psychopathy there. But it does suggest. I was saying to them, actually, this is great timing. I was saying to them just yesterday. I was like, if you compare that to the data we have, it's like, we're showing positive affect here. And so it does seem like that probably matters. But when you put yourself in the agent doing the harm, you kind of, in order to regulate that distress, not only do you decrease that distress, you come to view yourself as justified. And not only does that reduce the distress, it actually makes you feel better, right? It actually makes you feel good about doing it. So I do think that you know, whether you represent yourself as the person doing the harm does matter, just based on those two data sets. Triangulate it. Now, we have nothing with the psychopathy subscale in either of those data sets. It's just the one with Jason DeCruz. But it would, based on what I know in that literature, my strong hunch would be that an individual higher on psychopathy would also not be nearly as distressed, you know, in representing, if they were trying to represent the victim. Like, the affective signal coming out of those situations just tends to be more blunted across the board. But yeah, I'm open to the possibility that there could be a difference there, but I do think it does matter whether you're representing the person in need or yourself. Yeah.
Great. You hit all the points that I was trying to hit.
I tried.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. Colby, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
So I do have a question, but first I wanted to also add, when you shared the point about just showing the person's face, and I think your point was to inferring sort of how they might be feeling or what's going on, what's the bigger picture. I just wanted to throw out, if you, I'm curious if you've ever heard about the Kuleshov effect in film, and if not, I would encourage you to maybe look into. I think it would be worthwhile research as part of that point. Kind of relates to. Sorry, what was that?
I've never heard of it. So what is it?
So the Kuleshov effect was basically the point that people derive more meaning from even just two sequential shots in a film rather than just one from one singular shot. So what he did is his experiment was showing a expressionless face, like, you know, for 5 seconds or something, and then cutting directly to a different shot where it was, let's say, a hamburger, and then going back to the expressionless face, and then again cutting to another shot, which was maybe a girl lying in a coffin. And people were inferring, just based upon the series of images, what the person's feeling.
That's so good. Could you actually send that? Can you follow up with me an email and just send that effect? So what's so interesting is, like, man, that episodic mind reading hypothesis, it's not just a hobby project, it's not a passion project, but like just did this deep dive and just kind of like swirled around and like put some of these ideas together. And so the affective, like, researchers studying emotion, people studying, like, you know, mental inference and mind reading, you know, they've done studies where you put people's faces in different backgrounds or different contexts, and they show how the emotional state becomes more ambiguous, difficult to read, or easy to read depending on the scene. What's so interesting, though, is they didn't take a step beyond that, which is anytime you don't have the person directly in front of you, you need to be able to, in order to represent that, you have to be able to bind them together. You have to bind those representations together, and you have to bind, you know, the detail of the person with the detail of the place. And the system that you draw on to do that is immunotemporal lobe system. It's your episodic system, you know, in order to relationally bind it together. And that brings to host, like, all these predictions that we know about how memory, like, you know, like, where is it easy to bind things together? Where is it difficult? Where are you likely to get false errors? Where are you likely to get misattributions? And that should lead to, those predictions should lead to differences in mental state attribution. But they haven't, it's just, you know, it's speculative at this point, but I think there's a strong case to be made there. So yeah, connecting it to like, you know, prior ideas in film theory would be amazing. So definitely, please send that.
Yeah, I'll send that your way after. My question, though, as well, I guess a more directed question to what you're presenting on, and this might be something that you did make clear, and my ignorance with some psychology, you know, pieces might just be clouding my understanding. But does your research, particularly around episodic simulation, does it parse out the difference between the subject imagining sort of like description or the imagery of the situation or remembrance versus the remembrance or imagination of the feeling that the scene invokes in them?
Yeah, we are able to tease to tease those apart, and you can show there is a paper with Elizabeth Kensinger where we do show a difference between scene and affect, and you can show independent effects there as well. And there's what's even so yeah, it does seem like they're separate effects, and both are in play. I think what was more surprising to people in the field was they felt like the affect was kind of an easier, more straightforward finding that was like, okay, yeah, more intuitive finding of like, okay, you'd expect to see that. I think it was the scene part that was more of the seen as the newer sort of newer piece of the puzzle that was being added. But yeah, both are in play.
Thank you, Colby. PD has a question, PD Magnus. Is there any reason to think that abstract features of a situation, like an action being right, are represented in the same mechanism of episodic imaging? Or is the core mechanism primarily about perceptible features?
Can you say, I got the perceptible features. Can you say it one more time?
Is there any reason to think that abstract features of a situation, like an action being right, are represented in the same mechanism of episodic imaging?
Yeah. So okay. I think there's a couple ideas here. One,
this is in a way related to Colby's question just now, where he asked about whether affect and perceptual features were represented in the same mechanism.
Yeah. So they both, they're both in play, but they're different systems. So like representing kind of that conceptual knowledge or judgment of like whether something is right is not the same cognitive process or supported by the same set of neural regions as being able to represent that scene. But what's so interesting is they do seem to feed into each other. So we are showing that like your ability to represent, like what you represent episodically does affect, how willing you are to do something and how right you think something is to do. What I think is so interesting, and this hasn't been looked at as well, is that flip side of that direction a little bit hasn't been fully teased apart. So there is work on plausibility. So what's so interesting here, right, is representing an episode and the more vividly you represent the episode in scene imagery affects how plausible you think it is. But there's also work showing that it goes the other way as well. And it's almost like it can be this feedback loop of things that are more plausible are easier to represent. And you can do manipulations on both sides to move them around and show that the direction goes both ways. And what hasn't really been done in a super clear, compelling way is to see whether manipulating the rightness of the scenario, how that affects your ability to represent. And we see it a little bit. It's a little bit in our Imaginative Resistance stuff. But I think it hasn't been directly and explicitly gone after as it could be. But yeah, broad strokes, that seems to be the case. So I think that gets at the question.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, PD. Natalie, you had a follow-up question. Go ahead.
I did, thank you. Again, forgive me if I missed this. I know we were talking about a lot of limbic components to all of this and talking about the hippocampus and parahippocampus. I know in the amygdala, we often see laterality, that one side of the brain might be more reactive to emotional stimuli than others. Is there also data looking at that in terms of like areas that you mentioned, like parahippocampus and hippocampus?
Yeah, I want to make sure I get this right. I think it was the case that we didn't see. I think we showed like bilateral. Man, I'm not going to get this perfectly right without going back into the details. But we do see bilateral significance for one of them and like bilateral trending for the other. So my hunch is that you're seeing both in play. And there's interesting questions of like, if you damage one side, does the other side compensate or things like that? So, but the data here is slim, right? So we have one study done on that. There's more coming down the pipeline. There's a study that's less focused on people's judgments and perceptions of how willing they would be or they're giving, and more focused on the empathy signal that arises from this. And so that study is being conducted now, and we'll see. So we'll have better, give me a year, and we'll see if we replicate the bilateral, effects here, or whether it comes out more strongly one side or the other. There's other work, Klaus Lamb at University of Vienna, and his postdoc, Isabella Wagner, have a preprint that's coming out where they show lateralized on the left. They show, it's not the exact same paradigm, it's an empathy for pain paradigm, but they show that the left hippocampus is tracking with people's empathy ratings, and that it's functionally connecting. Well, it goes beyond this answering your question, but yeah. So I won't make a strong claim right now. I think bilateral. There's some things for lateral on the left, but I think we need another 2 or 3 studies before we can start talking about that. But yeah.
Very cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Natalie. Rudy, you are next. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi. If I'm hearing right, the scenarios are shaped as a choice, a conscious choice, and by implicitly a conscious choice to exceed a cultural norm, a social norm, or to depart from a cultural habit. And I'm just wondering about the role of those norms and habits in the imaginative exercise. Whether it's, in the real world, of course, it's going to be very hard to untangle the extent to which there are cultural norms involved in a decision like this, and whether so I guess my question is whether you've thought about whether the experimental process can find a way to distinguish the extent to which there's gratification in exceeding a norm versus gratification in conforming to a norm.
Yeah, no, it's a super interesting question to think about, and we haven't explicitly tried to capture, measure, or count for an effect for a cultural social norm here. There is work on there's been more work done on the memory side for cultural norms and sort of like life script events, and how easy, how much easier or difficult it is to represent events that fit the norm versus deviate. So that's kind of an open question. What I think is interesting too with the norms and thinking about how it relates to memory and imagination is how like something that you experience more frequently, you're going to have like more traces or stronger memories to draw on in thinking about those norms versus things that like go against that, you're less likely to have experiences drawn. And so, I mean, which I think relates to the bigger contrast, and what I find so exciting about our ability to imagine is that it allows us to overcome the narrowness of our own past experiences. It allows us to go beyond. That doesn't mean that it's probably more difficult to represent those events, and you might not be able to represent them as detailed or as vividly, events that go against your experience or that go counter norm. But I think that the fact that we're able to is really interesting to think about, like, well, what's the implication of that? Like, if it allows us to represent things that deviate from that, is that like, what's the outcome of that? Does this system enable us in some way to move away from those norms if we so choose, or I don't know. I don't have data on it. It just gets pretty speculative, but it's super interesting to think about how those come into play. And I think it is related to some of the plausibility work too, where things that fit the norm are going to be rated as like more plausible as well. So yeah, no, it's a great question.
Thank you, Rudy. Chantel, you are next. Unmute yourself and ask your question.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Brent, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really amazing to sit through, and also to just kind of think. So I'm coming from a psychology background, but also thinking about decision making, and all of this plays into the work. So one of the things that I guess I was thinking about, so I had a lot of questions, but I'll just ask this one. Just thinking about the imagined condition, where I think this is a work from your grad student, in terms of thinking of someone taking a picture and then pushing them off of a cliff, and people imagining that normal condition, and then forget the other condition as well. But I'm just thinking, to me, it seems like it's not so black and white per se, and I'm wondering what would come out of it if you were to look at like a spectrum of keeping that same core question, but changing some of the conditions. So for instance, maybe for a photograph, some people might say, I can't imagine that, right? But then if you up the stakes and the ante, some people might say, well, so I think it kind of like shows the spectrum of what is good versus bad, because most people would say for a photograph, absolutely not, unless, you know, they're like big on Instagram and they want that picture, but most people would say no. But if you said it was to save like your child, or, you know, let's say for, you know, something that's a big driver in our society, monetary reasons, people might then change their answer. So how do you capture that? It's almost like kind of like dialing a scale. So how do we catch all of it? And when does good become bad and bad becomes good?
Yeah, great questions. And that last one's a big one. Like, when do you, what is, and that's what, and that answering that question is much more ambitious than like I'm capable of. That's what the field as a whole is trying to capture, right? But I think there's some really interesting ideas there. And, in terms of like, we have some data with like the mild harm, we have some data with like more extreme harm, but we haven't really kind of dialed in between the two. And I'm also convinced we haven't pushed the harm as far as we can go. But that's going to require like a new set of like, getting ethic and IRB approval and all that. And so like, we're not going to go that direction right now. But I do think what another part of your question, which is like, well, when you ramp up the benefit or the collective good that comes out of it, what's so interesting is that like, as you ramp up that good, oftentimes the good becomes more abstract and almost has like diminishing returns on value to the person because they have difficulty representing it, right? Like what does, so like when you think about the happiness of one person, you can you're able to represent one person being happy, but like, how do you represent like 1,000 people being happy or 1,000,000 people being happy? Like that's where it gets tricky and more abstract and feel more difficulty with that. And you see things like kind of classic social discounting, where kind of the further you get out from like, that specific concrete individual that you come to value other people less and less the further distant they get away. And this gets into work that graduate students in the lab are probably better equipped to answer, like Kyle and Zoe. But I think imagination can help us like traverse that a little bit, and can help us come to value those kind of distant experiences, those distant individuals more than you would otherwise if they were just like kind of like, some kind of conceptual abstract, like not present. So yeah, there's a lot there, but I totally agree with like, dialing it in between and like trying to find that continuum is interesting to try to like navigate to next. And, trying to maximize like how does this system relate to maximizing collective welfare and good, I think is a bigger branch, a bigger aim for sure.
And just add one little piece more. I think that that's part of like the work. I think that this field, along with other fields that are like kind of like on the periphery of this field, need to get there, because I think other domains are there. Like just like if you look in the culinary industry, the food industry, they know the bliss point, they know these things. So I think it would be helpful in terms of thinking about mental health, thinking about decision making, to know like exactly. But I know it's hard, but.
Thank you, Chantel. Evan, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess your talk was my first exposure to any of the moral side of imaginative resistance. I do know a little bit, a very small amount about. It's a topic that comes up in aesthetics as well, and so I know there's this. I think it's wanton theory that was like Gindler and then Greg Curry, where they were thinking in terms of an explanation that when there's this instance of imaginative resistance happens, we no longer attribute authorial authority, right? That we just think, you know, we were going along saying the author is the ultimate decider of what this is true in this world. And if it's, but what happens is I just stop giving that author authority. And so I was curious if you know of, or if you've done any work about that question, about the authority of authors, or about aesthetic value in general.
Yeah, so I've known that the aesthetic part I know is out there. I haven't directly kind of dived into it on my own. Jason would definitely be able to like better bridge our work to that. But yeah, we looked at, there's like several different puzzles in Imaginative Resistance, and we kind of like were able to triangulate 3 of them in that paper. The authority one is, yeah, I don't know how much this, like we know that like genre or like perceptions of genre fiction can like try to move some of this stuff around. Nina Strominger has a study along those lines, but I don't think the author part is, I think it has less to do with authorship and just more to do with like your ability or inability to represent the event, and then your sort of affective reaction to that event. I don't think it, but I don't know. And how it relates to the aesthetic component, I have no idea. Like I will fully own that at this point. Like I don't know how to graph the results we have to the questions of like that have come up on the aesthetic non-immoral side. But I think it's interesting to think about. And like, could you design a study that has kind of conditions that are morally neutral, focus on aesthetic components, and then use that contrast to kind of tease apart whether the same mechanisms are in play or not? I think it's possible, but I don't know exactly how to pull it off at this point. Yeah.
Thank you, Evan. I have a question actually, real quick, because it seems like we're all out of questions now. My question would be: has there been done any work in the difference between the effectiveness of witnessing someone's harm, such as in someone was seeing someone's child being hurt, as opposed to the difference, the data difference in seeing your own children's hurt?
Yeah, there's definitely effects, and people's reaction is graded on the social closeness of the victim or the social similarity. And so that does seem to matter, both in terms of how your empathic reaction to that individual. And that's actually one of the big debates that's been going on in philosophy and psychology, and a little bit in politics, is what's the morally right way to feel empathy for other people's suffering. And so like, should it be that you only, that it kind of stops at your friends and family and people that you perceive as close to you, or should you be feeling it for more distant others? And so and the same goes for altruism. And so Zoe and Kyle have looked at these questions about people's moral judgments of equality, inequality, empathy, and altruism. And there's kind of like some places where they line up, some places where they don't. But it seems like people say that like it's more okay to have more empathy or to help socially close compared to socially distant. But in the case of empathy, they say that it's most morally right to try to feel empathy equal for others based on their suffering and not based on who they are. So even though people fall short of that in practice, their moral compasses seem to be pointing towards the direction of you know, equally feeling empathy for others. So yeah, I know I drifted a little bit from the question, but yeah, it is. So social closeness does seem to matter, and your relationship with the victim does seem to matter here. But I'm just pointing out there are cases where like people say like, no, that shouldn't matter, right? Yeah.
All right, we have actually one more question that came in. I think that'll be our last question for the evening. This is from Ewan. Is it well known in charity organization and fundraising that one person can provoke generosity while a mass of people provokes apathy? Does this correlate with our moral representations of others somehow?
Yeah, so definitely charitable organizations are aware of this, and most people refer to this as something like the identifiable victim effect. And so you're more likely to see cases where they'll try to get you to form a stronger connection to an emotional reaction with an individual, and then tell you about like the larger picture, the bigger need. But yeah, that is like a tried and true technique. The second part, what was the second part of the question related to morality?
The second part was, does this correlate with our moral representations of others somehow?
Does it correlate with a moral representation of others somehow? There's interesting work showing that like, this is from Daniel Batson. So it could relate to morality in a number of ways. I'm just going to focus on one, which is people come to care about and give more to that individual than if you present a counter case where there's greater collective need but don't have an individual from that represented, then they're more likely to give and care about the counter cause that has the individual. And so this has led to some people in the field, Peter Singer, Paul Bloom, and a few others, saying that we need to reject empathy and mechanisms like empathy that lead to us caring more about an individual, because we come to disregard the greater good as a consequence of this. And we kind of push back on that a little bit in a new paper, but yeah, it does seem to play into one's own moral judgments as well as the broader debate about how can we maximize the collective good. What are the cognitive affective neural mechanisms that kind of are pointing that direction, and which ones seem to go counter?
Showing my biases, I was really thinking on a neural level. Do we represent one individual person in a different system or set of connections somehow than we represent the sufferings of a million other people? So there's work on in terms of the neural level. So there's been some work showing that I don't know. So an individual, and this is where it gets to that study I was talking about earlier, Isabel Wagner and Klaus Lamb, where they show it's an empathy for pain task, and it's individual getting shocked, and they showed the hippocampus kind of linking up with the fusiform gyrus in order to represent that individual, and then feeding into something like the anterior insula and the amygdala to read out that individual's emotional experiences. And so it does seem to be, without getting too much in it, it does seem like to be able to represent an individual, you have a much stronger signal in these quote unquote affective regions. But when it comes to decisions for the greater good, more utilitarian decisions, when people make those, you see stronger activity in something like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and in the VMPFC. So it seems like they're representing greater value and outcome. And some have said that they're able to increase cognitive control and inhibit that stronger emotional signal from the individual, and be yeah, I know that person's suffering, but we need to think about the maximizing utility of the greater good. So yeah, there does seem to be a distinguishing there. That work hasn't got into how it relates to the MTL too much. it's just this work has started going in that direction, but not directly. Can you use episodic simulation to like help promote, the collective good decisions to maximize collective good? Is kind of open at this point. Yeah. Cool.
That seems to be all our questions for the evening.
Well, that's all the answers I got. So that's good. It's good.
So, well, thanks again for coming, everyone, and thanks again to Dr. Gaesser for your talk. It was super interesting. And again, if you're interested in attending our future talks, we haven't announced our events for next semester quite yet, but you can stay up to date and get a say in what those events look like by subscribing to the listserv, following the instructions in the chat. So with that, good night, everyone, and thanks for coming.